here in just a second. Kevin, are you dynamically switching? Perfect. So thank you guys for everyone who's joining us. We're going to be kicking off our New Year's resolution web series here. And actually every week this month, all the way through, we've got a 5-part series on helping you be a better photographer. Kicking off our New Year's resolution web series here. So you're hearing a little bit of that echo that comes in at the YouTube player open in the background. So and one of our resolutions here this week is we're going to start off with being more organized with your images. But this 5-part series is going to help you be a faster photographer, a more efficient photographer, a more profitable photographer. So this is a great series, and we've put this together, and it's going to be hosted by Kevin Ames, who is our managing editor. So Kevin, why don't you kick things off?
Thanks, Rich. Absolutely. We're very excited about this series. It's sponsored by Adobe Stock. And what we're going to be doing is really helping photographers figuring out how to monetize. We're going to go over model releases. We're going to go over property releases, kind of involved in getting themselves ready to go out and make extra money in 2018. A lot of fun for the next 5 weeks. And I'm really looking forward to it. And we've got some great guests along the way. Is a really outstanding example. We've got with us Peter Krough, who wrote the DAM book, Management, and Tim Gray, who has Tim Gray Learning and Ask Tim Gray, which he's been answering questions about photography and digital imaging for the last 15 years. So let me introduce Peter. Welcome. You're joining us from Washington, D.C., right?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin and Rich, and great to see you, Tim. Great to be here, and happy to share some tips for people to get their image collection both safely stored and better organized.
Wonderful. We appreciate your being here, Peter. Tim, do you want to say hello? And you're joining us.
Hey, how you doing, Kevin? Everybody. Right? What was that?
You're joining us from Chelsea in New York.
It's yeah, freezing cold in New York City, so I'm extremely excited to be presenting a webinar from indoors. I know, Kevin, you got stuck here on account of that storm, and I was planning to be here for this.
I'm sitting in an apartment 20 floors above the city, looking straight at Freedom Tower. So it's a good view. Yesterday when it was white,
it's cold and slippery out there.
But anyway, let's not digress. Tim, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I have been a photographer for as long as I can remember, and I suppose more importantly, I've been really focused on educating, trying to help photographers make the most of their workflows first and foremost. And really that goes all the way from taking the picture in the first place through to managing your library of photos, making the photos look their very best, and then sharing those photos in interesting ways. And shockingly, many photographers have struggled with some of these steps along the way, and right after the new year, New Year's resolutions, what a time to help photographers clean things up a little bit.
Absolutely. That's so true. I mean, we've all faced that challenge. And for those of us that have been doing digital for a really long time, we've had lots of struggles going from different storage medias as well. So before we get going on much farther, I want to go back to Rich, discussion of Adobe Stock, who's generously sponsored this series of webinars.
Sure. Well, first up, thank you. One of the things that we try to do at Photo Focus is bring as much free content to photographers.
Okay, Rich, I think you've...
Lots of great, kind, generous people who are willing to share their time, is we ask a couple of cool companies to help sponsor some of our bills, like website hosting and email and all of these things that let us actually pay some of our writers a little bit of money for their time. So one of those companies is Adobe Stock, and they have done a cool program of making it easy for photographers to sell their photography and their video. And we're actually helping them raise awareness about photographers shooting video. And so this is a great opportunity because one of the things is that the stock photography market has been around for a long time, and it's pretty, I don't want to say saturated, but it's well covered. But the amount of 4K video out there, because 4K video is relatively new, there's a shortage of it. There's not enough great 4K video. So photographers who know how to make a great image and how to compose their shots and make cool things that look good, well, there's a huge demand for 4K video. And oh yeah, the 4K video clip earns more than 20 times more money when you sell one photo does. So Adobe wants photographers to know that this is a great opportunity. Even if you never thought about doing video, you can translate your photography skills into 4K video. Almost every DSLR and mirrorless camera these days has that functionality built in, and they absolutely accept that quality format that those cameras can shoot. So we'll put a web page up later if you're interested in being a stock contributor, but this is a great opportunity. And later on in this webinar series, we will talk about some monetization strategies where you can go from being a photo enthusiast to actually making money off of your photography. And as a side benefit, as soon as you start to monetize your photography, well, it's still tax deductible. So now a lot of the things that you want to buy and invest in become part of your business. You've got a little bit of time to become successful as a business person, but you can make this part of your business. And being a stock shooter is one opportunity for that. So thanks to Adobe Stock for sponsoring the webinar and help us raise awareness for it, as well as letting us get some of this content out to more people.
Great, Rich. Thank you so much. I've had a couple of comments in the chat window that say that my bandwidth is very choppy, and that's because the apartment I'm in here in New York does not have internet hotspot through Verizon. So I apologize in advance. And it's just one of those technological things that we have no control over. Things
will get smoother though on the replay as well. So hopefully that helps, and hopefully everyone else's voices are coming through clean. So Kevin may be a little choppy, but you did mention there, Kevin, there is a chat pod. So if people would like to post questions, please do so. We will see that, and we'll try to take those during the show.
I'll be doing that. Also, we want to get started now with Peter. You have 10 thoughts that you want to share to help people get organized. What are those?
Okay, let's take it away. So I'm going to talk about this philosophy that I have that's part of the most recent book, second most recent book, Organizing Your Photos. And the mantra is store, tag, and create. And the idea is that the base of really making an image collection is a good, effective storage. You can essentially only either do it right or wrong. And you want to put your stuff away, stack it up, and back it up. And then on top of that, we can use tags to let us find images within the collection. And then on top of that is the curation layer, where we make cool stuff with our pictures. I'm mostly going to be talking about storing and tagging, since that's kind of the foundation, and let's roll with it. These tips are based upon the kind of questions that I get and the problems that I see with different folks. And the first thing I have to say is that it's really important to consolidate your image collection, and really I think we should be thinking of it as a media collection, into as unified a single archive as you possibly can. Hard drives have gotten really huge, and that has let us build these archives and not have to do as many tricks to deal with the fact that you might have 20 different drives. Right now you can buy a 10 terabyte drive for something like 300 bucks, and you can put a whole lot of stuff on there. So get large drives and bring everything together. And in my case, that includes not just my professional photos, but I'm also bringing my phone photos into the same unified collection. If you need a multi-drive array, then you can get that. But if you can get by with one single large drive, do that instead. Number two, use a simple folder structure to store your stuff. And really, your folders are just there so you can stack it up and back it up. And my strong suggestion is to use something, say, based on date. In my case, it's year, month, and project. I don't go down to a day level with my folders, and that just lets the whole thing stack up very neatly and grow organically. Number three, have at least one full duplicate backup of everything. And again,
so important.
Yeah, it's huge. You know, when I'm a magnet for people who have problems, and you know, the first question is, what's your backup look like? And in a perfect world, what they've got is a duplicate hard drive that's the same size as the primary. They've just got everything copied over to that. Again, the drives have gotten so cheap, you can store so much data on them. I would just strongly suggest you have duplicates, even if it means you have to buy 2 new drives instead of 1. Ideally, you would also take one offsite. This is tip number 4. This 3-2-1 backup was another mantra from my first book. 3 copies of everything you want to keep, 2 different media, and 1 stored offsite. Back in the day, I used DVDs as my second media. These days, I'm using a cloud backup as my second media. But it really pays to just have your stuff on that one other drive you can just carry off-site. Again, it can be very inexpensive. And what you want to be able to do in the event of a problem is if there's a fire or a theft or a flood or something like that, that you can just pull your drive back on and you're up and running exactly where you were beforehand.
So Peter, before we go past that thought, there's 2 things coming up in the question pod that kind of relate to this. One was, I think a lot of folks don't fully understand that if you unplug a hard drive, eventually they start to demagnetize. So they're not shelf-stable devices. So can you talk about when you do that offsite drive, how do you handle that? And,
Sure,
are there any strategies? And then what's also come up is, what about mobile photos, things you're taking on your phone and other devices? Do you have a way to sync all of those into your main library?
Okay, so first question about the offline drives. Yes, absolutely, you want to periodically bring it on site and exercise it. Make sure it appears to be working okay. One of my later tips is to use DNG because it has this checksum, this storage validation key that's written into the file. And you can point your Lightroom catalog, if you're using Lightroom, at the backup drive and say, validate every image on that drive. And it'll go through and it'll make sure that it can read every bit on every single file. And if you do that every 6 months or even a year, you're extremely safe. Modern hard drives don't have the same kind of problems that older drives did when they were stored for too long, but still you don't want it to go longer than 6 months or so, ideally. As far as mobile, I use Lightroom Mobile, and I have it set to bounce everything that I shoot from my phone into my Lightroom Classic catalog, and it just does that in the background. And so my primary catalog of images includes everything I shoot with my phone. If you're not doing that, then I would suggest just downloading through your computer's operating system or your phone software and keeping a copy on your hard drive along with your big camera photos.
Peter, when you're working in Lightroom with your mobile, do you keyword them and tag them the same way you do your, as you say, big camera photos?
I consider them all to be part of the same collection these days. I'm shooting a ton of panoramas with the phone that I just absolutely love, and I'm getting also great portraits and other shots. So yes, these days I consider it just one of my several cameras that I use. And so once it bounces into the catalog, I just treat it like every other photo.
Great. So are we on number 5 now?
Yeah. Okay. Try and stay within the time limit here. 5, catalog everything. And what I suggest is that you make comprehensive catalogs of your entire collection. If you're a Lightroom user, the ideal number of catalogs is 1. That's the way they've designed the program. And if you can fit everything in one catalog, go ahead and do it. If you're like me and you've got, coming up on 1 million images and one catalog is just too slow for general workflow, then you have to think about how to divide those up. In my case,
I ran into that problem too.
I have a greatest hits catalog that also has my recent jobs in progress. I did write a book on multi-catalog workflow for this specific reason. There's a lot of workarounds in Lightroom, but they're all a little bit ugly, and you have to understand exactly what you're doing, or you can run into a little bit of trouble. There are other programs, Media Pro, the Phase 1 program is a great one to catalog. Again, you really want to be comprehensive so that you remember, that you can find everything and that you can put it together in useful ways.
Now, we have had a couple of comments in the chat pod, and there are worth pointing out. There are other solutions for cross-app syncing. Ted brought up Mylio, which is a solution that a lot of folks like. There are other people with asset managers out there. And keep in mind, there are lots of great file sync utilities that you can use to keep drives mirrored together. For example, on the Mac platform, I tend to use Carbon Copy Cloner a lot and do verified copies. And so, you know, what's naturally happening on my own is I've got a lot of stuff going to one Drobo. Every night it makes a verified copy to the other Drobo, and then Backblaze is pushing it up to the cloud for an offsite backup. And it's become automated so that, you know that if I've copied it to the first drive with a verified copy, which is an important copy, not just a drag and drop copy. A lot of people skip that. Yes. Then there's a pretty good chance that it's okay on the other places, and I don't have to remember to do everything. And then a couple of days later, I'm okay to erase that memory card. But you know, I think that's one thing. And Tim, a little later, and Peter, let's put a pin in to come back to that verified copy thing that I think a lot of people don't know about, but we can revisit that one.
Yeah, we can maybe even have a link to, there's some content up on DP Bestflow that shows verified copy workflow.
Very good website.
So, I'll try and get through the rest of these here as quickly as possible.
We'll keep interrupting you. It's good.
Yeah, that's all right. Okay, so I suggest, and again, I'm a Lightroom user, so this, you know, I'm in this ecosystem, that I suggest using DNG as the storage format for raw files. You can also use it for your phone photos, and the primary reason from a integrity point of view is the fact that the DNG has this embedded checksum in the file, and you can, with a single command in Lightroom, have it run through literally hundreds of thousands of pictures, verifying that every file has remained uncorrupted sitting on the storage. And you know, it's not all that frequent you run into a problem, but when you run into a problem, it's usually a repeating problem. It's usually a bad network or a bad cable or a bad drive or a bad enclosure. And when there's one file that's corrupted, it's very likely there are other files that are corrupted. And so it's important to spot this early before you lose a lot of stuff. And DNG, with its verification tool, there's almost nothing like it in computing in terms of the ease and the certainty that you get out of it. Moving into how to organize your stuff, I suggest that you add a few keywords to your images. I do not suggest going crazy overboard with keywords. I keyword for the name of the shoot, the client, the project, or event name. Most of my images just get a handful of keywords. I use a hierarchy in Lightroom, and that allows me to stack up all the events. And inside events, I have family, and inside family, there's, you know, birthdays and other celebrations. And this just lets me find things really easily. I'm not going through and keywording for tree and car and you know, stock search kind of keywords, because those aren't really important to me. Keywording for my dogs, keywording for my daughters, keywording for, you know, friends and family, yes, I do. But just a handful allows you to find those pictures quickly. I also shoot, like, travel all over the world, and I strongly suggest using location tags, and I use the IPTC location tags, which are country, state and province, city, and sublocation. That's a very well-supported kind of plain vanilla location tag. And almost every picture in my collection has a location tag. And I really find things very often by location. You know, I remembered I shot that in China, or I shot that over at Caldwell's house, or I shot it, you know, I'm looking for something that I might have shot in Chapel Hill. So location tags, super simple. Yeah,
Peter, people are continuing to be concerned about the hard drive and DL. How reliable for long-term storage are portable hard drives? And he asks about Western Digital and Seagate in particular. And I think that might be worth a couple of moments.
Sure. So the first thing to remember is that every hard drive is out to get you, and you should expect that any one of them could fail with no notice.
And I think people also forget, Peter, aren't like all hard drives made in the same 2 factories around the world? So it doesn't actually matter what the label of the brand is. They're all coming from the same 2 places.
Yeah, there really aren't a lot of hard drive manufacturers, unlike SSDs, where kind of any joker can buy a bunch of NAND and solder it onto a board and make an SSD. But yeah, hard drives are very expensive to tool up for. There's only a handful of factories. But, you know, any of the major brands it's all a crapshoot. You know, I tend to buy what's on sale. If they're the same price, I would typically buy a Hitachi, but you know, who knows? Yeah. If you really want to noodle that hard, Backblaze puts out a yearly survey of the failures they have of hard drives by model and by brand, and you can definitely spot drives that have a bigger problem. And it's a freely available. Just Google, you know, Backblaze hard drive report or something like that. You'll find it.
I will add that recently Sony came out with some SSDs that were rated for photographers and video, and they actually include data recovery in the plan with it, and they're serviced and they're verified and they're designed for high-speed transfers and things like that. So there are, and you know, you made a bit of a joke on it. Tim, you may have an opinion on SSDs as well. They aren't perfect. So let's finish up with your list there, Peter, and then let's move around that, because I think Tim's got some good things to share.
I know he does.
But there are some questions here. There are lots of brands that work, and a brand that could be great can all of a sudden have a bad batch. And so I guess the other thing that I would say is I don't usually buy multiple hard drives from the same bin at the same time. I'll order them from Amazon and other places, so they come from different batches.
Yeah, the exception would be if you're putting a RAID together and you want them all to be the same for spin up time, etc. But yeah, and quick tip on that, I tend to buy the Samsung, I think 850 EVOs are what they are, as my SSD drives. They've been quite reliable and nice and fast. Okay. Location tag, two more items. Quickly, use ratings to float the best images to the top of your collection. I believe that ratings are designed really to do this, and if you understand it that way, as I'm going to give images a higher rating when I want to float it to the top and be able to find it more easily, that's, I believe, the best way to use ratings. And I suggest that you create a collection-wide set of definitions for your ratings. And mine are 1 star means I'm going to keep it. 2 stars means I'm going to show it when I'm looking at this shoot. 3 stars means I'm going to recommend it for this shoot. 4 stars means it's above just best of the shoot, but actually a best of collection image. And 5 stars is the absolute best portfolio. If your stars mean the same thing across the whole collection, they are a lot more useful than if 4 star means something over here and something entirely different over here. And finally, the last thing is and this probably is a good handoff to Tim, is to curate inside the catalog the work that you do to put your pictures together into useful groups. Is really the most valuable stuff you do to it. You tell stories, you choose the best pictures, you decide what to print, you decide what to send out to clients. And if you do that work, and in Lightroom you would use the collections, and there's other analogous tools in other software. It lets you, it's like a playlist in iTunes, and it lets you eventually over time build up a tremendous amount of information about the best pictures, because you can put them in 100 little piles, and the best of your pictures are going to need to be in 100 piles. They're in a portfolio and a print me and a send off to this or that. So those are my 10 tips, and I'll
Great ones, Peter. That's really wonderful. Before we get on to, I do want to take a minute to say some nice words about Adobe Stock. And they're making this series of resolutions for photographers happen to kickstart their businesses. Organizing the photo library means choosing photos and videos to Adobe Stock. It becomes more easily. And stock sales are mailbox money. The work sells. It's worth the time to find compelling photos and video to send Adobe's way. Does the marketing with keywording through Sensei, which is their new AI engine. Darn good job. And it provides a way for marketers to find just the images looking for, moving or still, that supports their message. So if you want to learn more, go to stock.adobe.com to learn more. That's stock.adobe.com. And I want to go over to Tim now. I know that you have another idea regarding collections, because we had lunch the other day and I thought that was very interesting. So, Tim?
Well, yeah, and one of the things I want to start off with, my focus today is on organizing in Lightroom. And, I would say that with Peter's presentation, it's a little more broad-based. Obviously, as Peter mentioned, he's using Lightroom as well. But Peter also provides excellent advice. His DAM book is applicable to virtually any software that you're using, because it's really focused on workflows in general. So I just want to emphasize that I'm really talking today about Lightroom specifically, so going into a little more detail about some of the features that relate to Lightroom. But also, one of the things that I think you'll notice is that Peter and I agree on a lot of things, and we might not agree on certain things. And that's a key thing to keep in mind, is that there's not a single workflow solution for everyone. You'll notice a couple of differences in some of the things that I use in my own workflow. And so worth keeping that in mind. It's also worth, I think, starting off with CC versus Lightroom CC, which is now Lightroom Classic CC, not to be confused with the newly named Lightroom CC. Anybody confused besides me? So
I think Adobe's confused.
For me personally, I think that Lightroom CC is not quite ready for most photographers, at least in the context of the way I think about a photographic workflow. If you're primarily a mobile photographer, meaning you're using an iPhone, for example, then Lightroom CC might be a perfect solution, even though it's a little bit limited compared to what's now referred as Lightroom Classic CC. If you're thinking that the cloud synchronization is a great feature that is of interest to you, then just be aware that Lightroom CC, the new product, the cloud-based product, doesn't have all the features of Lightroom Classic just yet. So you want to pay careful attention to those features. But when it comes to organizing in Lightroom, the very first thing, which really is not the first thing, but it's the first rule that I would give you, is that if you're using Lightroom to manage your photos, everything, I mean everything, needs to be initiated inside of Lightroom. The biggest problem photographers cause for themselves is going outside of Lightroom to rename files, to rename folders, to move things around, to reorganize their storage, and suddenly Lightroom's catalog is very, very confused, and the photographer is very, very frustrated. So once you've started using Lightroom, it is critically important. Everything. You want to send a photo to Photoshop, no problem, but do it from Lightroom. Do you want to add keywords? Fine, but do it from Lightroom, etc. So a very, very important tip, that everything, and Peter was referring a little bit to curating inside of Lightroom. That'd be the same basic concept, really.
Before you move on from that point, Tim, one thing that I think is really useful, and it builds off of a comment Peter made earlier with DNG, is that the DNG format is an interesting format because it can actually encapsulate and save those edits right in the file rather than in the library or a sidecar you might lose, and keywords and metadata and lots of other things get embedded in. And that DNG format is a standard. Tools like Perfectly Clear and Luminar and On One can open them and use them. So if you ever find yourself, don't keep using Adobe forever. A lot of folks were turned off by DNG thinking that this was an Adobe format. No, it's a lot like PDF, which is a standard that Adobe helped create, but it is incredibly universal, and it's going to make it easier in the future if your libraries become corrupted or disorganized to sort of rebuild them and reorganize them.
Yeah, and to your point about doing everything in Lightroom, Tim, when I'm explaining how Lightroom works, doing stuff outside of Lightroom, like in the Finder or in Bridge or in Windows Explorer, is like rearranging the furniture in a blind man's house, because he's going to bump into stuff and he's going to get hurt.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good point. And then, feeding on all of this, really, I said the first rule is that you've got to do everything inside of Lightroom, at least initiate everything inside of Lightroom. But even before that, you might say, it's really critically important that you actually understand Lightroom. One of the things that's a little bit unique about Lightroom compared to many other software tools out there for managing your photos is the fact that Lightroom is using this central catalog. It's not just a browser, it's using that catalog to manage your photos. And if the photos and the catalog get crisscrossed, get confused, you're in big trouble. You're going to have a hard time keeping your photos organized, being able to find anything. And so making sure that you actually understand how Lightroom works. I know many photographers, I like to joke about the fact that the first time you install Lightroom, it shows you a message saying, click import to begin. And I think it should say, go buy a book about Lightroom, or go watch a video course about Lightroom, or take a class to begin. That's where you really want to get started. So just make sure, if you're not familiar with Lightroom, or for example, if you're thinking about switching to the new Lightroom CC, play with it with a test copy of some of your images first so that you can get familiar with that workflow. You'll be glad you did.
I haven't asked Tim Gray question. and it is, yes, if you accidentally or forget, do stuff outside of Lightroom, is there a way to synchronize the Lightroom catalog back to what you've done on the hard drive?
Yes, there is, but I would caution that you can't necessarily recover from everything that you've done wrong. So for example, in Lightroom, you can synchronize a folder if you renamed some images out on your hard drive directly in the operating system, and now they're disconnected. There's ways to disconnect the missing folder. You can locate missing images. You can also use a synchronize command. That synchronize command can synchronize metadata. So if you forgot and you added keywords outside of Lightroom, you can synchronize. But of course, if you've spent the last 5 years sometimes adding metadata with a certain tool and sometimes adding it inside of Lightroom, things can get crisscrossed. I'll talk about another recommendation in terms of workflow in Lightroom in a moment that will help address some of that as well, to help avoid some of those problems. But there are ways to synchronize. You've just got to be careful that you haven't gotten too deep into a mismatch between that data. Repeat of what Peter mentioned earlier, but just to sort of emphasize the point that we want to be working ideally with a single catalog. So Peter's up to 1 million images, give or take. It's a lot of photos. Oh, I'm sure 4- and 5-star rated, right?
No.
And I've got I've got something like 300,000 or 400,000 images in my catalog. I recognize at some point it can become a little unwieldy, but to the extent possible, and for the typical photographer, I talk to a lot of photographers who have 20, 30, 40,000 images in their catalog. That's perfectly manageable. If possible, I prefer to have a single catalog in a, so that I've got all of my photos being managed in a single location, essentially. I don't have to think about which catalog to open. I just go to Lightroom and start working with my photos. And then also kind of expanding upon what Peter was talking about on folder structure is to actually come up with a thoughtful folder structure. And the way I typically approach this is to name your folders based on the way you think about your images. For some photographers, they seem to typically be the photographers who have a day job as an engineer. The date-based folder structure is great. For me, that doesn't work at all. I don't know what day is today. If it hadn't just been New Year's, I wouldn't know what year it was. So dates don't work for me, and so instead I use an approach based on typically location, because for me personally, most of my photography involves traveling somewhere for that photography. And so that's the way I think. If I want to see photos of crop dusters, I know I photograph those in the Palouse, for example. That's my approach. If dates work for you, great. I'm not concerned about what your folder structure looks like as long as it makes sense to you. Because keep in mind, sometimes software goes away. Aperture users can appreciate this, where you got to find another solution. I want to make sure that I have a base level folder structure that I can always fall back on. A little bit of paranoia.
That's really good advice.
And then when it comes to Lightroom, one of the biggest challenges, and I think one of the biggest sort of motivations with the new Lightroom CC is to try to streamline things, because admittedly, the import feature of Lightroom Classic is potentially a little confusing. There is a lot going on there. Now, for me, I like that there's a lot going on there, because it means in the process of copying my photos from my media cards to my hard drive, I can make a backup copy, I can rename them, I can add my basic metadata, I can add some keywords. I can be so efficient and get so much done. But you can also make mistakes there. So you really got to become an import master. If you're going to use Lightroom, you've got to understand how that import works. And you can't get complacent. You've got to make sure that you check all of those different settings so that you know where your photos are going. You know that they're going to the right place. You know that you've checked everything so that you're not leaving something that, you're putting images from a brand new photo shoot into the folder for a previous photo shoot, for example. So you've got to be familiar with all of the options that are there and make sure that you're using them correctly every time you import your photos.
I think this brings up an interesting point, though, which is you mentioned the new Lightroom earlier, the Lightroom CC, which is using more of a tag-based solution as opposed to folders and hierarchy. Right. We have a new solution emerging soon from the folks over at Skylum, formerly MacFun, and it looks to me, and looking at some of the screens, that that's going to be part of it as well, that it's more tag and rating based and metadata based to sort and find things. So I guess what I would put out there, much like how you said different people use different tools and software tools go away, I'm not looking to start a war or an argument here, but if this folder-based approach isn't for you, because it's not for some folks, there are other solutions out there. But I think maybe what I would say, Tim, is that there's a lot of people who want to use Lightroom Classic because it is a classic and it is a workflow that's well documented with a huge community of training of resources and longevity and sort of an industry standard for at least a good time. If you are going to do that, you kind of have to suck it up, Buttercup, and stay organized, or you're going to screw yourself. Or if that's just impossible and your brain doesn't work that way, then maybe you should consider one of these new tools that uses computer-assisted organization, I guess is what I'm putting out there.
Absolutely.
So why don't you guys talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, and on some level, you could say that a folder exists. A folder is just metadata. Folders are fake. Now, they exist a little more tangibly, in a manner of speaking, on the hard drive, not literally, but figuratively, at least in the context of an operating system. And so, in theory, as long as you access that hard drive with some sort of operating system, you've got that folder structure. And so that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable knowing that I have that folder structure to fall back on just in case. But it's an excellent point. Some of the things, if you take a look at some of the search features, so Lightroom CC with its Adobe Sensei searching capability, where I can search for airplanes or hot balloons or what have you, even if I've never added those keywords, because there's image analysis going on. So a lot of this, depends on each individual's photographer's needs, which software they're using, and their comfort level for, am I going to not keyword my photos at all because Lightroom CC has this Adobe Sensei feature and theoretically it can analyze and find all of my photos? I really know everything that I want to know about my photos. I'll talk more about keywords in a moment, but now I'm giving up some of that control. So this this is really essentially psychological profiling when it comes to defining your workflow. I'm a control freak. I am, paranoid about managing my photos, and so I'm going to take a certain approach. Other photographers are more concerned about long-time archival. For example, having other people besides themselves be able to make sense of their photo library. And in that context, a date-based structure, frankly, makes more sense than the approach that I take. And so part of it is just your comfort level, your need for cloud-based synchronization versus your psychological need for having everything right here on your local hard drives, etc. There, again, as I said it right from the start, there's not a single solution that works best for everyone. It's helpful to listen to experts like Peter, to people like me, like to talk a lot, and all these, get some of these different opinions, make sure that you can put those opinions in context, so that you can make informed decisions based on the feedback you're getting. Just because somebody who talks really loud says you should do it a certain way doesn't mean that's the right solution for you. So you need to be thoughtful about whose advice you're taking and whether or not it makes sense for you
I've got one
personally.
data point on
Sometimes,
this.
yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Which is that one of the reasons that Adobe went to that is that mobile operating systems, which they see as kind of this thing that's taking over computing and certainly a huge influence in photography, does not use a traditional file system. And one of the problems that the Lightroom team had over the years was that by creating all this flexibility for file system, they made it impossible to synchronize properly to mobile device. And so that's why they just started all over with the CC version. And it's going to be a long time. I'm probably a cold dead fingers guy on the file system, but there are some real advantages to allowing, if you want your stuff everywhere, you want it on multiple devices and drives and computers and stuff, then you kind of have to give up control over the folders, and that's why it's there.
Right, no question. So then there's been a couple of points here about the importance of metadata, and I'll talk more about some of the specific examples of metadata here in a moment. But for example, Peter talked about that validation with DNG files and even recommending the use of that DNG format as a general storage, an archival, you might say, storage format. And we talked about the Lightroom catalog. It's important that you back up that catalog. But another thing that I recommend is to employ the option in Lightroom to save your metadata out to your actual image files. There's a setting in catalog settings to automatically write metadata out to it references the raw captures, the proprietary raw captures. It actually relates to all of your image files. The only difference really is, are we putting a sidecar file for a proprietary raw capture versus putting metadata into the actual image file for other formats? What that does is takes any of your standard metadata, so things like keywords and star ratings, and puts that into the actual image files on your hard drive in real time, so that if you lose your Lightroom catalog, you've not lost all of your information. It's critically important to keep in mind that that does not include everything. So for example, collections in Lightroom, that's a Lightroom specific or a catalog-based feature. That doesn't go into metadata. Same thing for pick flags and reject flags. Your overall workflow, and bear in mind that while I recommend using this option to help preserve your metadata and to make that metadata available to other applications, if you need to browse your images using Adobe Bridge, for example, you can still see your keywords and star ratings. So there are a variety of benefits to that. In theory, it's going to cause a little bit of a performance lag, but in my experience, it's not even noticeable, honestly. So it is a setting that I do recommend enabling in catalog settings. Keep in mind, by virtue of being a setting in catalog settings, catalogs, you would need to establish that setting in of your individual catalogs. It's specific to the current catalog that you're working with. And it's the next step here is really just a repeat of what Peter mentioned in terms of curating, of identifying your favorite images so they'll bubble up to the top. Mentioning once again that pick and reject flags are, you can think of essentially as being Lightroom specific feature. And so my personal recommendation is to use star ratings, just because that is a metadata standard that is, somewhat durable to the extent that it can be. And I use a similar approach actually to what Peter recommended in terms of, we might think 1 star equals a bad image. To me, it's a waste of calories to assign a 1-star image to a bad image unless I'm going to delete it. And so to be thoughtful. So maybe you're a photographer who wants to delete your outtakes. That's not me. I mentioned that I'm paranoid. I don't want to delete anything just in case I end up missing it later. Define what your, for example, star ratings or color labels mean, and then use those consistently, as Peter already mentioned. Peter also mentioned keywording. I completely agree. One of the points that I would make about keywording is that it serves 2 purposes. In theory, those keywords are there so that you can locate something. I assign bald eagle as a keyword to a photo, and now I can find the picture of a bald eagle based on searching for that keyword. But also those keywords serve as a memory aid, so I can remind myself of what exactly was that building or location or species or what have you. And as Peter mentioned, I certainly don't recommend going crazy with keywords. If you're a stock photographer, you're probably having to add a lot more keywords than a more typical photographer. But think about, what do you want to be able to search for, and what do you want to be able to remind yourself of? And I would amplify, there's other metadata that you might add as well. One example that Peter mentioned was location data. One of the reasons that I upgraded to the camera I'm currently using is that it has a built-in GPS receiver. To me, that was worth the price of upgrading all by itself. Because as I mentioned, for me, a lot of my photography is for the express purpose of going somewhere and taking pictures. I want to remember where those places were, and I can also use the map module in Lightroom, for example, to actually locate images in the first place. To just kind of browse around the map and, oh yeah, I remember when I was at that place, I got a good photo there. Maybe I'll use that image. And so this, different photographers will have different needs. If you're a studio-based photographer, GPS coordinates, probably not the most helpful metadata that you could add to your images, but be thoughtful about, what you're going to need or what will be most helpful to you to remind yourself about details of your photos, as well as to help you locate those images. And that's what you should be emphasizing in your workflow. So keywords can certainly be incredibly helpful in that regard. There's other metadata like location information, etc., that may be helpful as well. What all of this boils down to, and I think sort of sums up a lot of what Peter was saying and what I've been talking about here, is that you need to define a workflow, to clearly define an organizational strategy that you'll be able to consistently follow in Lightroom. So something that, and Peter pointed this out with several examples of being very consistent with star ratings, for example, how you define those, making sure that you understand what your own workflow actually means and how you're going to implement it, and then following that workflow really, really consistently. If you make a change, be sure to go back and change your existing metadata. If you decide, actually, the pick flags, that's maybe not the best solution, I should use star ratings instead, well, then go back, filter images based on those that have a pick rating, and assign a star rating. Maybe you just assign 3 stars to any image that has a pick flag, for example, or whatever makes sense for your own workflow based on the way you think about your images. You've got to make sure that you'll be able to make sense of your own workflow and to follow that workflow consistently.
Now, before we switch topics, you guys had brought up visual tagging. I put this in the chat pod. I don't know if anybody's ever tried this yet, but John R. Ellis, who makes a lot of Lightroom plugins, makes one called AnyVision that taps into Google's Cloud Vision technology. And basically, it allows you to do the auto tagging of 200,000 images for free, and then they give you 1,000 images a month. Google then charges you like $1.50 per 1,000 images that you visually tag. But it's the same sort of technology. It's made from not Adobe, but this would actually give you visual tagging within your existing Lightroom catalogs. And for a lot of people watching the show, 200,000 images done for free on a plugin that's also free or classified as pay what you want. Have any of you ever tried this solution of using Google's tag?
Yeah, I tried that plugin and ran it through some fairly extensive tests, actually. The thing that I found it most useful for was in a recent book I wrote about rephotographing your images, slides, prints, albums, and such. And the AnyVision plugin using Google Cloud Vision does a great job of actually converting visible text into metadata and letting you drop it into the caption field, and it becomes searchable metadata. So there were a bunch of really cool old clipping books that my grandparents had, and we just photographed all the pages, ran it all through AnyVision, and then it all became searchable. So I could find, my grandmother's name anywhere and have the images come up, and that was cool. I then also did the keywording, and I ran keyword search confidence level. You can say, give me, 98% confidence, 90, 80, 70, 50. I ran it at 50, 70, 80, and 90. And I gotta say, not all that useful. I'm gonna do a blog post on it, but about half the time it could get a dog or a cat. The only thing it was really good at was not safe for work images. And it was pretty reliable about that. My dad had done a lot of travel, Africa and Central and South America, and he had.
So we're airing the dirty laundry now. This is excellent.
and it did a really good job with those, but it did not. It really wasn't useful. Now, if you had a corporate library and you were, say, a tourism bureau, and you needed to tag for like waterfalls and trees and parks and sunsets, and you had 200,000 images and you had no tags, man, that would be worth like $1.50 or whatever it costs to do. It's unbelievably cheap. It's like I think you can get 1,000 images tagged for $1. I think that's 1/10 of a cent.
Yeah, and they give you 200,000 images for free to start. So
yeah, they give you a $300 credit, and yeah, AnyVision, it's absolutely worth checking out. And we're going to see some really great stuff with this in the future. What I like to say is right now that's a kind of an intelligent 5-year-old, maybe an intelligent 4-year-old. 2 years from now, it's going to be a 12-year-old. And some of these services are actually getting really good at very specific tasks like species recognition or, not safe for web images. There's a huge market for that. So it makes sense that they would make that good. And OCR, the text, images to text is also one. But yeah, pretty cool. I wouldn't call it ready for prime time yet.
Okay, well, that's great. Tim, really good. I think that's a really good overview. And I think what everybody needs to take away is we've got to aggregate everything into one place. If you're going to stay in Lightroom, stay in Lightroom. And if you do it the right way, can be moved into other platforms should the need arise. And I want to take just a moment and thank our sponsor, Adobe. It's the place where videographers and photographers can sell their work to businesses, to web designers, artists. It's easy to search thanks to keywording, which we've been talking about. Keywording is done with Sensei, the new artificial intelligence that Adobe uses for this. Easy to use website where stock video and stills, they're available as watermarked previews, which I think is really cool because you can go through and you can get client approval before committing dollars to purchasing any visual content. I really recommend that you take a minute to see how easy it is to find the perfect video by going to stock.adobe.com. That's stock.adobe.com. Browsing the videos and photos and the previews. So I'd like to get an overall discussion going in the last few minutes that we've got. And I see that some people have actually been able to download that plugin. So that's really useful. So do you have any closing comments, Tim?
Well, I think the most important thing, as I mentioned, is really to define a workflow that makes sense for you. But part of that is figuring out what does make sense. And so really just taking the time to understand what your various options are. And to me, one of the most important priorities for most photographers is going to be simplifying. So try to keep your workflow as streamlined and simplified as you possibly can. So as we've talked about, try to use one catalog in Lightroom to manage your entire library of all of your images, if that's at all possible. If you can, use a single storage location so that all of your photos are essentially on a single hard drive, recognizing the lines get blurred there with something like Drobo, where you've got multiple drives acting as one, but having all of your photos stored in one place, backing up, but just having a workflow that is as streamlined as possible, as streamlined as makes sense for you. So as simple as possible, not simpler, and define that workflow in a way that you understand. It's meaningful to you. It's achieving your goals as a photographer, and then being consistent.
Rich, you have an awful lot of data. You do a lot of videography. Do you have anything to add on this management as well? I know you're one of the hosts, but you like myself, you're a working photographer as well.
Sure. One of the things that I would point out is that depending upon your style of photography, or if you do add video to your workflow, the prospect of keeping everything online is not actually feasible. And I don't mean online in the cloud, I just mean on an active drive that you're working on, because I've had a media production company for 20 years. We do tons of client work and we shoot video all the time and time-lapse productions. And I got to tell you, it is not all online, to say the least. And I've got, I literally have 17 Drobo unit, 8-bay units that are filled with drives that are active right now in the server rack. And that's probably a fifth of the data that we're actually going to create in 1 year. So we're a bit crazy on that side, but we're getting paid for it. And this is all billable time and billable assets, and clients expect that we have it. So one of the things I would put out there is learn from the financial industry, which is consider making an LTO backup. If you think burning to DVDs or Blu-rays is a good idea, it's not a good idea. Those will fail. They will start to chip and flake over time. LTO is this linear tape that is designed to be shelf stable for about 50 to 100 years, and it's backwards compatible. So I can get the latest, fastest drive that's higher capacity and put in stuff that comes from years ago, and it will still read it. And so it's a standard that's been around for a long, long time. And you could take those LTO backups and put them in your vault. The thing to realize, though, is that a lot of people don't do this. They're like, oh, it's kind of scary. Like the drive's like $7,000. Oh my God. But the tapes and the cartridges are really cheap, and it's a bit of a hit up front. But if you are going to do this professionally, or you actually care about your stuff and you want something that will last for 2 or 3 generations, it's the best thing out there. I don't know, Peter, if you have any strong feelings on this, but I think a lot of people don't realize that hard drives are like tires for your car. They're the things that you put on and they're going to wear out and blow out at the worst possible time. And if you think a hard drive is an archive, you're an idiot. And I'm sorry to be that blunt, but that's what it is. These are tires for your car. They will go flat. They will blow out. They are not an archive. It's a working system.
Yeah, I would say, storage is a process, not a place you put stuff. And absolutely, storage was 60 megabyte hard drives. In the beginning of digital photography, all the way back, it was 1 megabyte hard drive. But yeah, I think you have to understand that drives will go bad, and your objective is to get your stuff migrated onto the next thing before it goes bad. LTO is good for video production house. For if you've got only 20 or 30 terabytes of total data, for a couple of $1,000, you can have that on 3 different sets of hard drives, including one off-site, and that's probably better for most photographers. But if you're a busy video shop like you are, then LTO makes sense.
I would counter, though, Peter, because you brought up that fact that they will eventually go bad, and I know a lot of people who have that off. You really are rigorous, those drives will eventually go bad sitting on the shelf. They'll demagnetize. So I guess what I would say is it's, I can change my oil too, but there's a certain benefit of, well, I archive this to something that's designed to be able to sit on a shelf for 100 years. That way, when I screw up, because I forget to migrate my data to another drive and back it up and move it over, it's a big hit up front, but I would say that over time, if you think about having to swap those drives out every 3 to 5 years, it's worth considering. Again, it's a matter of when do you want to spend your money? Now, every month, every couple of years, or one and done. And I'm a guy that likes my stuff to be safe forever.
Well, and this brings up really a broader point, Rich, in that there is an element of we need to manage our data over time. So it's not just a right now thing, as Peter says, like a process in terms of storage in general, in that it's not just about hard drive versus tape or traditional hard drive versus SSD. what about file formats? And what about formats for the actual hard drives, FAT32 versus, HPFS, and all these different formats for the drive, the way they're formatted, and operating systems. And I mean, how many graphic designers have a closet somewhere full of zip disks that they have no way of actually reading anymore, because even if they had the drive, it had this connector called SCSI that nobody has anymore. So there's this.
I found some orb discs in the closet Tim, the other day, and I laughed. If you remember those are the cheaper alternative with higher capacity to zip disks.
Yeah, and so there's that issue of file formats, storage formats, data connection formats, I mean, there's a lot, unfortunately, in the digital age that we have to manage versus taking your film, putting it somewhere environmentally safe, hopefully, and hoping for the best. We got the advantage of being able to create multiple identical copies of our files, but there's a management over the course of time that we have to keep up with as well, unfortunately.
That's why we centralize.
There's a lot of debate and a lot of discussion on how best to do this. And we've had 3 of the best experts in the industry weighing in on this. And I really want to thank everybody for joining us at this webinar. Do we have any closing thoughts? We'll start with you, Peter.
The thing that I'll say is that once you understand how the technology works, and it's just like any artist using any medium, become the master of your medium, and the technique can fade into the background, and the thing that sits in front of you is your ability to be creative. And I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Tim said about, systematize, simplify, and if you do that, you really can have your photography be front and center, and you can make cool stuff out of it, which is what we're in the game for. I think.
Rich?
I think for me, the part there that's always hard, and I had to chuckle when you mentioned about Aperture, because I was an Aperture user. It came out before Lightroom did, and I liked it, and it worked for me. I'm at the point right now where I spend more time organizing my physical hard drive structure than I do organizing a catalog. And I use the DNG format to keep my information inside the files. And so right now I'm auditioning several different tools. I'm excited with the new one coming out from Luminar. I've certainly dabbled in On1, and I've looked at some of these, and I'm a big fan of Adobe software. I've always used Photoshop. It's just a matter of what works for you. I've never actually been completely satisfied with Lightroom, and a lot of its speed issues have irked the shit out of me through the years, because it just hasn't kept up with other Adobe software. Like, wow, you're excited that you got GPU acceleration. You accelerated Adobe Illustrator 4 years before you got around to Lightroom. I mean, come on. So there's certain things that they need to get around to, and they're putting that effort in, which is great. And I'm glad that the team is working on that, and that it's gotten significantly faster with the last update. But I think what it comes down to for me is remember that all of these software products are tools, and software is just software. It's your system, the project management, and your ideas about rating your images. Peter's advice was fantastic of be consistent on what your stars mean. Don't use flags, I think Tim pointed out, because that's a proprietary thing to Lightroom. Stick with things that are standards. Have your own standards, and use things like tags and star ratings that are consistent, so that if you ever find yourself needing to make a change, you can do so. And so this means that you really have to give this some thought, because you want that stuff to be findable. It's going to mean getting a job. It's going to mean finding that image to sell if the client comes back, or even if it's just your hobby, it means being able to get at it. So I really think before you worry so much about the software, sit down and do a little pen and paper work and figure out your approach to staying organized, and then follow it. And you might have to go back in time and work through your old stuff, but you're going to be happier that you did.
Tim, last word on this.
Well, I would say that there's a lot of information here, and for sure, I can appreciate that for many photographers, it'd be very intimidating trying to figure out what the heck am I going to do to get my photos organized and to maintain that workflow over time. And I think it's a good analogy, sort of jumping off of what Peter was talking about. Photography is a technical art form. And so somebody who gets their first camera and has to try to learn to go take pictures, they might have a creative eye, but they can't even think about creativity because they've got to figure out how to work this contraption first. and then they've got to deal with exposure and all these different issues. But eventually, as you get to know the tools of photography, you can sort of let that be in the background. It comes a little more naturally. You can focus on the creative side of things. And I would say the same holds true when it comes to your workflow, your post-production, as it were, your post-capture workflow. Take the time to figure out your workflow, to define it in a way that makes sense, that you can consistently follow, and it will become more of a habit. You can't get complacent, but you can make it become more of a habit where you don't need to work so hard at your workflow, and you can focus a little more on what, to Peter's point, I think that most of us are really focused on, hopefully, is that creative side of photography, being able to go out there and have fun and make great images, confident that our exposure is going to be good, our photos are backed up, our workflow makes sense, etc. So if it feels a little intimidating, just keep in mind, this does get easier if you take the time to really focus on defining a workflow that makes sense for you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Tim and Rich and Peter especially. And I want to remind everybody that the second installment of our webinar series, I Will Register My Copyrights, happens this coming Thursday. Yeah, I hear some, and I know that everybody on this show does that. It's going to be at 3 o'clock Eastern, that's noon. And the reason that it's important is that when the shutter is clicked, you own the copyright. But until it's registered, there's no teeth provided legally for someone that infringes. So we'd like to invite you to join me, Jeff Veal, who is an intellectual property, and John Slimp, a member of the board of directors in Atlanta, photographer at Aero Graphics, who will talk about what copyright is and actually how to register your copyrights. So get your questions ready. We're really looking forward to having you join us next Thursday. And I want to thank you all to this webinar. And remember, there are a lot of good tips and information on photofocus.com. New featured stories, 6 in the morning Pacific time. That's 9 o'clock on Eastern time. I'm your host, Kevin Ames, and we'll talk to you soon.